Okay, so in this last component of our development and quality of life discussion, we're going to go over some different development indices. And so the goal here is to go over some different ways to measure development. This is not meant to be comprehensive. There are other means, but this show you some alternatives basically to GDP per person. So the overall questions here we're going to answer is what is the Human Development Index? What's Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index? Can we measure happiness? Is that a way to measure quality of life? What's the Happy Planet Index? And what is the triple bottom line? These are the main questions. Okay, so remember from the previous lesson, the overall issue here is how do we determine which countries are more developed and which are less? Okay, so how do we put a number? So how can we rank countries in terms of development? And so again, GDP per capita is pretty common, at least if it's implied, if not, specifically meant to indicate development. But one alternative is something called the Human Development Index. Okay, so the Human Development Index was developed by the United Nations as a way to measure the level of development. So instead of just taking how much money per person is generated in a country, it takes three overall factors. So it includes the life expectancy, it includes the mean years of schooling and expected years of schooling, so that's sort of knowledge, and then also includes your GNI per capita, so gross national income per person, in purchasing power parity numbers. So again, this was mentioned earlier. Purchasing power parity just means it adjusts your income to the local cost of living. So $30,000 a year in the United States, if you have a family of four, not much money. You're going to be in the poverty in poverty at that point. If you make $30,000 a year with a family of four in, say, Bangladesh or Mongolia or Niger, you're probably doing okay. So the purchasing power parity adjusts for that. Okay, so this is HDI. And so the goal here is to measure quality of life more holistically, okay? And so they say human development is the end and economic growth it means. So this speaks to the issues we discussed with steady state economy, Herman Daly and all these folks. Economic growth is helpful, but not always. So really what we're trying to measure is human development. So economic growth may contribute to it. We've looked at some examples of where it doesn't necessarily lead to it, but really what we're looking at is human development. So let's take a quick look at some of the rankings here. So here's, this link is on the PowerPoint or on the PDF. So this is the 2016, the most recent report at this time, and this is your countries ranked by HDI. Okay, so here's your HDI rank in this column. You can feel free to sort of mess around with these. But you can see that we have Norway, Australia, Switzerland. So basically a lot of Europe and then a few, Singapore, Canada. So the United States is all the way down at number 10. So I'm just curious, let's look at the GDP ranks. So GDP per capita. And a good source here is the CIA World Factbook. This is, by the way, a really good source for information about different countries. Okay, so here's our rankings in the most recent rankings. Some of these are from various years, but the CIA World Factbook is a really good source of information. So we can see Liechtenstein is the top GDP per capita country at that's crazy, $140,000 a year per capita. Qatar is number 2, and so on. So let's just look at Liechtenstein just to see where they fall in the HDI. So LIE. So you can see the HDI rank. Liechtenstein's all the way down at number 15. Now, granted, they have a relatively high HDI, but it is significantly lower than a lot of these other countries. Okay, so Liechtenstein at the top. And let's just do the next one. I'm just curious where Qatar is. So Qatar is all the way down at number 33. So they are 33rd in HDI and number 2 in the per capita. So that just goes to show that these rankings don't match up very well at all. And that's kind of the goal of HDI, is to get away from this notion that just because a country is wealthy, that they have a high level of development. Okay, so feel free to mess around with those numbers. Um, but that's your Human Development Index. Okay, so that's one way to measure development. So another one, so this is Human Development Index. So there's a slight adjustment to this, something called the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, or Inequality Adjusted HDI. So what this does is this takes your HDI ranking, okay, your HDI score, excuse me, and it adjusts that score based on the equality of outcomes in that country. So as one example, right, so our life expectancy is part of HDI. So if you think of a country that has a relatively high life expectancy, a relatively long life expectancy, but that's just your average life expectancy. So if you have wealthy people, for example, that are living a really long time, and low-income people in the country are not living for a long time, you could still have an average life expectancy that's long, but the outcomes are very unequal depending on your socioeconomic status. So that's what this Inequality Adjusted HDI, it adjusts the HDI score based on the equality of outcome. So let's just look, again, this is from the World Bank, or excuse me, the United Nations. So again, here's your HDI score, and here's your Inequality Adjusted HDI, again, and this is linked on your PDF. But what this so this is not actually ranked in order of Inequality Adjusted HDI. What you have to do is look at the difference from rank. Okay, so let's look at Norway for an example. So Norway is the top HDI at 0.95 basically. So the Inequality Adjusted HDI drops to just under 0.9. So you can see it's going to drop a little bit, right? So from 0.95 to 0.9. Now what it just so happens that Norway is also the top in Inequality Adjusted HDI. But let's look at the United States for an example. So here's the US numbers. So the US is number 10 in terms of HDI globally. Now their Inequality Adjusted HDI drops to about 0.8. And so the result here is that they lose, it says minus 10 spots. So in other words, the US is number 10 in HDI. You have to subtract 10 from that, so they're actually 20 in Inequality Adjusted HDI. Korea is a pretty good example of another extreme drop. So they're number 18. They actually dropped 19 spots when it comes to Inequality Adjusted HDI. And so that's the value of the Inequality Adjusted HDI, is that what it does is all it does is drop your HDI score to reflect the distribution of these outcomes that are measured by the Human Development Index. And then some countries like Finland goes up 9 spots. Slovenia goes up 9 spots. The Czech Republic goes up 10 spots. So it adjusts your score based on the quality of outcomes. Okay, so that's a little add-on to HDI. Okay, so another way to measure quality of life is, and it may sound silly, but measuring happiness. Okay, so it's an interesting question to think about. If you want to find out whether or not somebody has a high quality of life, how do you find out? Like if you had to, do you look at these data that say, well, there's the average education is this high and the average income is this high, and you can come up with all these numbers that are sort of objective ways to measure quality of life. But what the World Happiness Report seeks to do is actually find out whether or not people think they have a high quality of life. Okay, and so it's really a way to measure happiness. And so the question is, how do you measure? Like, how would you measure happiness? And what they've come up with, what they decided is the best way to measure happiness. I mean, there's really no objective way to measure it. So you just ask them. And so this is how they measure how happy people are. They ask them this question: basically, how satisfied are you with your life on a scale of 1 to 10? Okay, so that's, instead of trying to figure out, okay, we have all these factors that we can objectively measure. Is everybody educated? Do you have, I mean, even you can measure things like how democratic is your government, what's your GDP per capita, all that sort of thing. So what they've determined is that really the best way to figure out how people are doing is just to ask them, okay? And so it's really straightforward. And I guess it begs the question, if you think about it, let's say you have a country where people are very, they're not educated, they don't have a long life expectancy, maybe they have a really corrupt government. But if you ask that person and the average person said, yeah, actually, I'm really happy with how everything's going, should we seek to change their circumstances? They have a really bad government and they kind of, by all objective measures, don't live a good life, but they feel like they live a good life. The question, an important sort of development question is, should we actually try to do something about it? So it kind of takes a little more of a direct approach to assessing quality of life. Um, and I mean, I don't know, this is a question to ponder. Do you think this is actually important to measure? Should we be measuring happiness, or should we measure things like education and life expectancy and so forth? But I mean, this World Happiness Report, it sounds kind of, fuzzy and, kumbaya-y, I guess you could say. But the researchers that have come up with this index are really well regarded. You have Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University, that's internationally known as a development expert. And so this is a really robust, statistically robust um, way to measure happiness, and so it's definitely legitimate. And what they've done is not only do they measure how happy people are, but they measure all these other variables and try to determine to what extent each of these sort of more objective conditions, how they impact people's happiness. So what they do is they look at things like, what impact does income have on happiness? What impact does life expectancy, social support, all these different factors? Because the goal here of the report and the people that created the report is to promote development, promote quality of life. And so what they try to do is figure out as much as they can what actually leads to people having a high level of happiness, which to them basically means a high quality of life. And so what they do is they actually they do statistical analysis, and they figure out how much do each of these factors impact happiness. Okay, and so this is from the 2016 report. Okay, so this is color coded, and these are the top 20 happiest countries in the world according to the report. Okay, and the width of the line here, the length of the line, indicates the level of happiness. So you can see the number here. So Denmark's at the top, and the average score, happiness score, is 7.5. The 20th happiest country is Luxembourg, and their score is 6.8. Okay, so the happiest have the longest lines here. That's, it indicates this 7.5 number. Okay, so that's the total happiness here. And what each of these color-coded segments indicates is the percent of total happiness that they can attribute to each of these factors. So the yellow is that portion of happiness is explained by GDP per capita. The orange or red, whatever color that is social support. Blue is healthy life expectancy. Green is freedom to make life choices, and so forth. And so I think one interesting outcome of this is that even though money does, like a high GDP per capita does not necessarily mean that a country is, you could say, developed or has a high HDI score, is even happy. If you look at these lines, you can see that GDP per capita actually is probably the single most significant factor in the happiness scores. So the story here is that GDP per capita is really important, and this is something that has been mentioned a number of times, that money is really important to help people achieve, and get things that help to increase quality of life, like healthcare, like education, food on the table, shelter, all that sort of thing. So money certainly contributes to happiness, but you can see that the vast majority of the happiness is not attributed to income. Okay, so this is just another way to measure quality of life. They do this research every year, every 2 years. They actually assess global happiness. So it's pretty consistent that these Nordic countries are the consistently rank in the happiest countries. It's Denmark and Switzerland basically switch back and forth, although in the most recent report, Norway and Finland were at the top. But it generally, the happiest countries tend to be these Western and Northern European countries. Okay, so that's your happiness index. Another way to measure it is something called the Happy Planet Index. So make sure you watch the video that's posted if you haven't already. And so what the Happy Planet Index does is, again, it's a metric, so it's a hard number that's meant to help rank countries in terms of their development. So the formula for Happy Planet Index is they take your well-being score times your life expectancy score times your inequality of outcomes. So this is, you know, pretty common in a lot of these metrics. But what's really interesting about Happy Planet Index is it actually divides it by the ecological footprint. And so, first of all, experienced well-being. Okay, so they measure this well-being it's basically just like the happiness index. You ask them directly. Okay, so it's kind of a weird thing, but it works. You basically have people imagine they're on imagine a ladder where 0 represents the worst possible life. So imagine your worst possible life and 10 is the best possible life. And you just report on which step of the ladder that you feel like you currently stand on. So it's a way that's supposed to be sort of like everybody can understand this sort of metaphor of the ladder and feel like where they are on that ladder. Okay, so that's your well-being score. Okay, so then you have your life expectancy, which is converted to a number, and then your inequality of outcomes, that's kind of like your inequality adjustment, like the Inequality Adjusted HDI. So if you're very unequal in the outcomes, then it's going to drop your score. If you have an increased life expectancy, it's going to increase your score. Increased well-being is going to increase your score. But what's interesting is with your ecological footprint, so think about what happens if your ecological footprint goes up. So if you're dividing by the ecological footprint, as that goes up, your Happy Planet Index score actually goes down. So it's meant as a way to adjust for environmental sustainability, at least in terms of your ecological footprint. So what's interesting is that, I mean, this is of all the indices that I've seen, this is the only one that I've seen that actually includes ecological footprint in the calculation. There is some criticism of this. Seems somewhat arbitrary, just because these, the ecological footprint number, it doesn't necessarily mean anything on a regular scale. Really, what the ecological footprint does is it helps you rank countries. Because if you have a country that has really good, high well-being, long life expectancy, and so forth, but they have this huge ecological footprint, what it's meant to do is drop them in the rankings to indicate that they aren't, achieving sustainability from a holistic perspective. Okay, so those are the indices we're going to look at. So we're going to look at a few charts now that measure various factors in quality of life, or that contribute to quality of life. So this is a chart. This is TOE per capita, so it's just energy use per person on your x-axis here, and this is HDI rank on the y-axis. And so each of these dots is a country, and the black dots are your industrialized. You could think of your OECD countries, and then the white dots are your non-industrialized countries. And so what this chart is meant to tell you is, as energy use per person increases, what's the impact on human development, or HDI specifically, okay? And so there's two, feel free to press pause and think about what this chart tells you, but there's really two main outcomes of this chart, or messages from this chart. The first one is, at first, so think about sort of from here to the left. So at a low level of energy use, more energy use, generally there's a general upward trend. Okay, now you can have really low energy use and still have a really high HDI, at least at the lower levels, but generally it's more or less an upward slope. Okay, but the second part is, after you reach, let's say, about the 4 TOE per person, so if you look from here to the right, really more energy use does not equate to more development. And so at a relatively low level, and this is known in domestic and international development circles, that it's important to provide or make sure people have access to at least a minimal amount of energy. And that's one of the main goals of a lot of these people like the World Bank and so forth, is to at least provide access to some energy. But then once you reach past a certain point, it just seems like more energy really doesn't mean more development in terms of your HDI. And you can think of all the other things that come along with that, higher ecological footprint, more waste, more emissions, and so forth. And so past a certain point, it doesn't look like more energy really helps. Okay, so another way to look at sustainability or measuring sustainability, this time from a more business oriented perspective, is to look at something called the triple bottom line. Again, this is one of those concepts. It's known out there in the business world and the sustainability world. But if you think about a business and they refer to their bottom line, what are they referring to? And really, it's all about profit, right? So what's the bottom line of a business is how much money are they making, and that's really it. So what the triple bottom line does, and this is from your reading, it's more than profit. It's what's usually called people, planet, and profit. So in this case, so profit is just profit, okay, just like the regular bottom line. People refers to your social responsibility, and then planet refers to environmental responsibility. Okay, and so when you have a company that is a triple bottom line company or that tries to address the triple bottom line, what they do is they try to address all of these elements of sustainability and measure their impact on people, on the planet, and on profit as well. Okay, so just one example of this. So fair trade is a really good way to address people. So if you look at, let's click on this. So without getting into too much detail, you have to buy something and you want to know that the workers were treated well, that were paid a decent wage. You can look for this fair trade certified logo. And so there are a lot of different products that have fair trade certification. Coffee's become a really big one, like chocolate's a really big one. There are a lot of fair trade clothes and other products. And so what fair trade certified products, what this certification means is that you know that the workers were paid a decent wage, they were treated fairly, and so forth. Whether it's the farmers that grew coffee beans, the workers that harvested the vegetables, the workers that manufactured the clothes that were working in the factory. So you know that if you buy fair trade certified, that they were treated fairly well. So that's really just the people side of it, right? So just from a sort of broader perspective, and this is from your reading, if you want a business or somebody to pay attention to something, and this sounds like a general question, what you need to do is to be able to measure it. As they say in the article, only when companies measure the social and environmental impact will we have a socially and environmental responsible organization. So the philosophy here is that if you don't actually measure your impact on people and the planet, generally speaking, a business is not going to pay attention to it. Now this is certainly not universal. There are businesses out there that do, maybe they don't exactly measure this, but they do their best to address some of the elements of sustainability. But really, the best way to do it is just you need a way to measure, and that's what all of these things, all these individual metrics and indices are meant to do. Okay, so let's look at a few charts here. These are from, you can go to the Happy Planet Index website and download the data, but I'll just show you a few charts fairly quickly here. So first, this is income per person, and this is your ecological footprint. So income on the X, ecological footprint on the Y. And so each of these dots in the following charts are individual countries. So I think there's a really clear trend here, and if you actually do the trend line, pretty clear trend that as income per person increases, your ecological footprint tends to increase as well. And R squared value just means basically how well this line fits the dots. So think of it this way, if all of the dots landed on this line, the R squared value would be 1, meaning a perfect relationship between the line and the dots. The closer you get to 1, the higher the correlation. So this is a pretty high R squared value, which means this is a good fit line. And so generally speaking, higher income per person indicates or goes along with a higher ecological footprint. So what's interesting, if you want to look at the actual sustainable ecological footprint, so remember we only have one Earth, so one planet living, the line would actually be here, so about 1.8 give or take. This is hectares per person. And so what this means is every dot above this line is living above their mean. So only these countries down here are actually living within 1 Earth of an ecological footprint. So obviously we have a long way to go, but generally speaking, the further you go up in income, the further away you get from that line, okay? So here's your well-being. So here's your ecological footprint versus well-being. So how does, if you have a higher ecological footprint, does well-being go up? Sort of. I mean, there's a little bit of a trend, upward trend, but it kind of levels off at the end. It's really pretty jumbled here. This has a low R squared value, so there's not really a great relationship. So yeah, generally speaking, if you have this higher consumptive lifestyle, you might have a little higher well-being, but the relationship doesn't look that great. Here's well-being versus income. So does more income mean more happiness? Yeah, sort of. At a low level, kind of like what we looked at before with energy use, at a low level, yeah, it looks like maybe more money is going to mean more well-being, but there's, past this point, it looks like more money might even be less well-being. And also, you can have pretty low income and have pretty high well-being. Now, keep it, take all this with a grain of salt. These are all average numbers for entire countries, so it's not perfect, but it does give you some indication. So if you look at life expectancy versus income, so income versus life expectancy here, or excuse me, life expectancy versus income. Again, clear upward trend at the beginning, very clear upward trend. So it looks like, at least a moderate amount of income, about $10,000 or maybe $7,000 a year. It's a pretty steep jump, but then it really levels off. And, life expectancy looks like it just basically maxes out at, around 80 years. And then you look at the HDI versus your income per person. Again, HDI does tend to jump up pretty significantly at low levels of income. Then once you reach past a certain point, it tends to go up just a little bit, but it really kind of levels off as well. And so the overall key points of all this, one, the Human Development Index includes education, life expectancy, and GDP per person. So it's a way to measure a lot more things than just GDP per capita. Again, it's a way to try to quantify the development in a country. So Inequality Adjusted HDI, adjust your HDI score based on how well it's distributed among the population. So the happiness index, remember that's the one where you basically ask people how happy they are, and so you allow them to determine their own level of development. So it's a direct way to ask the people how developed they feel like they are. Now the Happy Planet Index includes all 3 E's into one number. It's, I would say a little bit arbitrary, but it does at least integrate that, the ecological footprint in there, which addresses another aspect of sustainability. You have the triple bottom line. This is one, again, there are companies out there that are triple bottom line businesses, but this is pretty well known in the business and sustainability world as a way to measure their 3E performance. Okay, and that's it for this lesson.